I'm Daniell, co-founder. Today, Sid mentioned he was the graveyard slot. Not sure what's after the graveyard slot. Maybe it's the resurrection slot. So we're going to talk a little bit about Trenches Law, what we do, where we come from, a bit of our background. Then we're going to talk about specifically Wayleaves. I'm guessing you probably all know what a wayleave is, but we'll go over a bit of that. We're going to talk about some of the challenges around Wayleaves, some of the common problems. And then we're going to talk about a bit of the wayleave. So as we're in the resurrection slot, we're going to try and keep it interactive. So if there's any questions, by all means, put your hand up and we'll answer them as we go. And then hopefully with some feedback, we can kind of set the pitch as to how detailed you want to go, or do we need to keep it at a high level. So Trenches Law, we set up in 2017, so that is myself and Sharon, the other co-founder. So we met almost 20 years ago at Virgin Media, and that's where we met George, as we call her, Georgina.
Not 20 years ago, though.
Not 20 years ago, no, 7 years ago. Okay, don't rub it in. George has lowered the average age by at least 20 years in the room, I think, so well done, George. So I've got, as we heard just a moment ago, background in sales in Virgin Media and in telecoms. Sharon was head of Wayleave at Virgin Media when Virgin Media launched their Lightning programme, which was their plan to connect another 5 million homes. Sharon was asked to form part of that team, and one of her responsibilities was Wayleaves. So she consolidated the Wayleave teams within Virgin Media. At that stage, which was probably 2015, there were 200 Wayleave officers in Virgin Media. We haven't got quite that number, largely due to the automation. But just as an interesting fact, so where I met George, as you mentioned, I was running the mobile relationship team. So one of the projects I was responsible for was a project to roll out fibre to base stations for Telefonica. So we had upwards of 1,000 orders in progress at any one time. 950 of them would be in Wayleave, and George was my Wayleave manager at the time running those. So after a couple of weeks of the deep dives into the Wayleaves, I thought there's got to be a better way of doing this. Hopefully we've gone some way to helping that. It's still an ongoing challenge. It's probably, I would say, the biggest barrier to the rollout of full fibre in the UK. So hopefully we're making it easier, still a long way to go. So I won't bore you with the details. So we've got a bunch of industry experts that form the management team. We actually took the decision about 4 years ago that we now recruit on attitude rather than experience, because we're trying to break the mould. We don't accept anybody say, but we've always done it like that. That's why we do it. We don't do it like that because we did it like that last week. So that's our kind of ethos. We've probably got low 70s customers now. Started off in the altnet space. We're now across the whole tier from Virgin. We work for Virgin Media and Openreach, and then a whole raft of altnets, wireless providers, and we've dealt with some wacky Wayleave applications, from riverbeds to tunnels to railway infrastructure. So yeah, we've got a wide breadth of knowledge. There's two parts to our business. There's I was going to say traditional law firm. We're not a traditional law firm by any stretch, but there's a traditional law activity, which is regulated by the SRA. That forms about 25% of our business, and that is predominantly 90+% telecoms. We do everything from co-power applications to infrastructure purchase agreements, terms and conditions, dispute management, employee contracts, etc., etc. So we do the whole raft. The other 75% is Wayleaves. We do from a full turnkey solution. So we've got customers that have a design team. The output of the design team comes over to us, and then we tell them when it's ready to build. And we also do, bespoke elements of that. So we're a law firm. We have other clients and customers that have their own Wayleave teams. But when they get a difficult scenario, we invariably get involved in that, and then just our logo adds a bit of gravitas where, every letter we send out has got our logo on the front. So in a brown envelope with a law firm on the front, it's probable that those letters are going to get opened rather than something with an operator's logo on the front. So that's a bit about us. I think that's it. Hand over to George. George is going to tell you what a wayleave is.
So I don't want to teach anyone to suck eggs, so if you all are already au fait with wayleaves, apologies if this is a bit boring, but I think we've got a bit of a mixture of knowledge. So putting it simply, a wayleave is written consent from a private landowner to cross their land and install network. So wayleaves are used across all utilities, gas, electric, water, and telecoms isn't a utility, but arguably really is the fourth utility now. And they're underpinned by primary legislation, so the Electronic Communications Code. That piece of legislation is something that haunts me every night because it's the piece of legislation that we work with every single day. It underpins not only wayleaves, but the way operators as statutory undertakers work, and it gives them the ability to work in highways, lock trees, everything that they need to do to install a network. Wayleaves themselves only affect privately owned properties, so I think, as Kelly alluded to earlier, permits and wayleaves are an issue not only in the UK, but the USA, across Europe. I know in Germany in particular, it's been quite an issue. But here, permits for local authorities go through their own system, and wayleaves are purely for privately owned. That's shared drives, private roads, fields, multi-dwelling units, anything privately owned. Surprisingly, one thing that we come across a lot that operators aren't aware of is the grass verges. So they tend to assume that everything in the footway and carriageway that's not in someone's garden, it's maintained by highways. You often find your grass verges are maintained by the council, but they're private. And we have dealt with many trespasses where poles and cabinets have been sited on grass verges, so that's one that really catches people out. And going on to that, so not having a wayleave in place is a trespass, and we, on the legal side of trenches, as Terry alluded to, we deal with trespasses a lot, and can be quite serious, obviously depending on the nature of the work. So it's really important that wayleaves are in place. You can have the best design plans, you can have the best network, you can have all the will in the world, but if you haven't got your wayleaves, you're not going to be able to roll your network out. You're going to be really limited to your highways. And right down to the fact that if you've got two neighbours who are having a dispute and they've got a shared drive, you're not going to connect that customer if this one won't give you a wayleave. Having said that, there are some protections in place, particularly for code operators, which we will go on to. So we'll talk a little bit about the wayleave process first. We're going to go on to some common problems, then we're going to talk about how we kind of resolve those problems and make this process run a little bit smoother. So generally, it's quite a well-defined process, whether you deal with it in-house, whether we deal with it. It follows quite a generic process. So the wayleave officer will find out who owns the property, they'll go to land registry, they'll get the freeholder information, or arguably better if you can get managing agent information or freeholder representatives, and contact them directly. Contact them, ask for a wayleave, happy path, you send them your template wayleave, they look at it, sign it, think that's brilliant, send it back, say, off you go, operator, install your network in my land. It'd be great if that happened, 9 times out of 10 it doesn't. So you have to constantly contact these freeholders. We tend to use 3 or 4 letters at least, or emails to try and get this contact, and that's really underpinned by the processes that we think would be looked at if this were to go to tribunal later down the line, which as I said, I'll get on to. If the freeholder responds and refuses, you've got an issue there, you've got to deal with that. That's one of the problems we'll get onto. Sometimes you just have them, they completely ignore you. They think, we're not interested in this, we're not bothered. You find that more often than not. That's a huge issue in the rural space, because a lot of the wayleaves that you're trying to get are for third-party land. So you're trying to cross a field to get to another field to get to a mast site in a third field. And the 2 fields you need to cross first are say, not interested, no benefit to me. Why should I sign this wayleave? So that's one of the big problems that that we come across. But as I said, the process generally, send the letters to the freeholders or their representatives, a little bit of negotiation. I say a little bit, I mean, when I was at Virgin Media, and I think it might have actually been a Telefonica one, the longest wayleave that we had going was, I think, 60 months. 60 months of negotiation, backwards and forwards. It was a nightmare. So, a little bit of negotiation, then they sign it, then brilliant, we can pass the wayleave over, and that property, that piece of land, that building is ready to build. There's a couple of different nuances with the process as well, and it depends how the operator works. So you've got some operators that send out blanket wayleaves, they won't survey anything, they just send the wayleaves out, they want the wayleave signed, and then they think about the survey later down the line. Has some success. It's not so bad in the civil space, because obviously you've got your design plans that broadly show where the network's going. When you get to MDUs, if you try and skip that survey stage, it can be a bit of a nightmare. So one of the ways that we work is we obtain permission for the survey to be done. We get a wayleave signed at the survey stage. We then get a route approval signed to confirm that that route's accepted. So it makes it a lot easier then to pass that property back for build and avoids problems later down the line. So I've highlighted some of the key problems that we come across when we're dealing with wayleaves. I'm sure anyone who's had experience of them can think of probably more than what's on here, but broadly this is what we seem to deal with every day. So unresponsive occupiers is a big one. They just ignore the letters, they ignore the emails, or it might be that the freeholder is an offshore pension trust based in Jersey. You get their address from the land registry, you don't know who the representative is, constantly writing to them, nothing back. It's very frustrating, and the legislation that underpins wayleave, the code, does have a process already. So under paragraph 20 you can serve a statutory notice. So if you serve a statutory notice to the freeholder, they've got 28 days to reply. If they don't reply and you have no wayleave within that time, the operator's got the right to take that freeholder to court and ask for the court or the upper tribunal to impose a wayleave agreement on them. There's only 2 tests to be met. So there's can the landlord's prejudice be compensated by money? Usually yes. And what's the wider public benefit? And in the time that we're living in now, the wider public benefit is generally quite an easy one to answer for everyone. So there is that process. That process is really difficult to do with unresponsive occupiers because they haven't said no. They haven't refused. You can argue that it's tantamount to refusal, but they haven't. There is actually a new piece of legislation. So the Leasehold Property Act, or TILP, has recently been passed. I say recently, last year it received royal assent and then it went through a consultation, and a year later we finally got the results of the consultation, and the government's setting out regulations as to how that will be implemented. But what that essentially is going to allow us to do, where you have unresponsive occupiers, where you've contacted them, they haven't replied, if you followed the set process that the regulations will set out, and they continue to not reply, you can apply to have an 18-month-long wayleave just imposed on the building. So if they don't reply, you can't get hold of them, not going anywhere, you can apply to the court and you can have this interim measure placed on the building so you can go in and still build it. There's a few criteria you've got to meet, so it really only applies to MDUs, which is great in one space because, as you can see, one of the common problems are MDUs, but it does need to go further, we think, to business parks, to private roads, and potentially into rural spaces. At the moment it's MDUs. You have to have a customer in there who's requested service, and you have to have evidence that you've tried to contact the landowner. But we think that's going to be really helpful. Another big problem we have is costs. So another change to legislation that's recently is going through, it's with the House of Lords at the moment, is the PTSI bill that is going to make some amendments to the code. The government asked for a consultation on the code, and cost is one of the things that we personally contributed to the consultation about, because they are a nightmare. So there's two ways that freeholders can request costs. So you've got your compensation payments, which is fairly self-explanatory. If they've suffered a loss, they should be compensated for that loss. Feels fair enough. But included within that are their professional fees. Now, as a solicitor, probably shouldn't say this, but solicitors charge a fortune, right? So some solicitors. So for Wayleaves, the problem that you've got, Wayleaves is such a niche area. It's such a niche area that landlords are instructing property lawyers who don't understand what a wayleave is and they don't have the understanding of telco law. So the fees that they tend to charge, because the hours they need to spend on researching the telco law to offset with their property law knowledge, it just becomes astronomical. I mean, we would say, we would expect maybe £1,000, £1,500 in our experience would feel reasonable. I have seen fees quoted to me of over £10,000 to deal with a wayleave. Now we're talking about what could be a 3 or 4 page document. It's a very simple document. And there's no guidelines around that. That's what we asked for. We said, look, in this consultation, we're looking at the legislation, let's put some fixed guidelines around it. Like the conveyancing space, for instance, there's, we work within parameters, we've got fixed fees, why can't we have something similar here? But that was kind of cast aside, and surveyors' fees as well kind of come into that. The secondary payment is consideration payments. This is a bit more of a sticky area. So it's essentially just a payment as a benefit that the operator will pay the landowner to be able to use their land or their building and install their network. So under the code, the process for calculating consideration is arguably, I say arguably, it really is more in favour of operators really, because if we're looking at, in the mobile space for instance, where we look at annual rentals, the way of calculating the annual rental is open market value. So it's not the benefit to a telco provider, but if you want to put a mast on a rooftop, that's a huge benefit to the likes of EE, H3G, MBNL, etc. It's huge. But generally on the open market, it's not worth very much. So there was the first big case that came in under the new code in this respect was Islington and EE, Islington Council and EE. So EE had offered to pay, they used to pay, I think, between 5,000 and 10,000 a year. The new code came in that set out this consideration and this consideration calculation, and Islington Council said we want £12,000 a year. EE said we'll give you 2. It went to court, and the court found that actually the open market value of the rooftop was probably around £50 a year. And that there may be some costs to consider to allow them access up and that kind of thing. And they said, okay, maybe we could see it at something like £1,000 a year. Because EE had offered the 2 or 2,400, I can't remember what it was now, because they'd offered that, they were kind of held to that by the court, and that's what they had to pay. But importantly, the court found it's a nominal value. So we often refer back to that when we're kind of negotiating in these payments. And the other thing to consider, consideration doesn't always have to be money. So it's the benefit for entering into a contract. So the average house price, as we've seen, or average building price, is inflated by having access to fibre to the prem. So if you're a landowner, you've got an MDU with 100 flats, they're all connected to full fibre, you can rent those out. Like people want to buy them, people want to rent them. It's a selling point, particularly as we're coming out of COVID and so many people are still working from home. I bought a house last year and it was the first thing me and my partner checked. Can we get decent internet? We both work from home. He's a gamer, we need to be able to access that. So that's a consideration in itself. Thirdly, so we've got refusal of wayleave. I've kind of talked through that already, but where they come back, point blank refuse a wayleave, it gets to a point, if we can't negotiate with them, we'll always try. We'll say, look, let's be amicable. If we can't get there, then you've got the statutory notice that can be served. They've got 28 days to agree a wayleave. If they don't agree it, the operator can take them to court. One of the changes that's coming through the PTSI bill is going to be the introduction of more methods of ADR to try and get these landowners engaged and speaking with operators and get them to agree to something that's reasonable. And then finally, MDUs. So MDUs are a huge issue with wayleaves because they're a bit of a beast of their own. they tend to have multifaceted ownership, so you've got your individual flat owners who are your leaseholders. You've usually got a head leaseholder who sits above those. It could be a right to manage company, so it might be a mixture of freeholders who own individual flats. So you can have your individual flat owners, you might have a head leaseholder who works with a management company, and a freeholder above those. So it's understanding the ownership system, who's got the rights to grant permission. Your individual flat owner's desperate for service, they can't grant rights over the common area. Your head leaseholder says they need freeholder permission, you can't contact your freeholder. It goes round in circles, and for that reason, we're finding that a lot of operators are just skipping MDUs. So we've alluded to it in previous talks today. The big target is homes passed. MDUs should be an easy win. Should be an easy win for homes passed, but they're not. And the main reason for that is Wayleaves. It's difficult to get in. It's difficult to get the permission to get into them. So that's a big focus for us. We do a lot of work on MDUs for our clients.
And Grenfell's had a big impact on the behaviour of freeholders and managing agents. The fire stopping in most MDUs is pretty appalling. So it's a big issue with particularly the larger freeholders. They're really concerned about the fire stopping that's going to be employed post-installation.
And the biggest issue for Wayleaves is generally the sheer volume of them. A build just needs so many Wayleaves. So on average, 30% of properties in a build plan require a Wayleave. As I've said, it could be any type, it could be private roads, it could be MDUs. And that's where our automation tool comes in, which I will hand over to Terry to speak about, because the technical know-how is not my area of expertise. So I'll pass it to you.
Excellent. Thank you, George. So just to give a scale to the problem, I guess most people in here probably own their own house, so your house will sit on a title, so when you do the conveyancing, you get a copy of your title deed. There are 24 million title deeds in the UK. They're stored on the land registry. To access that data costs £3. So if you want to work out who owns the UK, it's going to cost you £72 million. So not a cost-effective and great system. The land reg launched in the 70s-ish. People don't update it. There's no legal obligation. So if Trenches changed our head office, there's a legal obligation. We have to inform Companies House of that change of address. That if Trenches owned some properties and we changed our head office, legal address, there's no obligation to update the land reg. So we spend a lot of time cross-referencing information because the land reg is wrong. We get a huge amount of upset people because we write to Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who own number 1 High Street. Mr. Smith passed away 6 months ago. Mrs. Smith naturally gets very upset that we've written to them. So ongoing issues around the data and the integrity of the data are a big problem for us. And when we first launched Trenches, the general process that we had, and a lot of operators still have this model, there'll be a Wayleave officer per build area, and that build area may be 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 premises. They would spend the vast majority of their time interrogating civils plans and lock lists of UPRNs that need a Wayleave. They would then interrogate land registry, cut and paste that information, which was probably out of date or wrong, into spreadsheets, do mail merge, do those mail merges, print them out, stuff them in envelopes, carry them to the post office. And that was the vast majority of the activities of a Wayleave officer. We've now flipped that on its head through automation, so that all of that stuff happens in the background, automated, and then the Wayleave officers are on the phone. They do a bit of work up front just to check the information that's coming in is accurate in terms of civils plans. But all of their time is spent on the phone to freeholders, managing agents, building those relationships, handling objections, getting past the issues about nobody in the building wants it, or I'm going to redevelop this place next week, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the kind of motivation. As I said, when we were running the project in Virgin Media, Sharon had 200 Wayleave officers. we're now running a project in South Wales, and we have currently 20,000 wayleaves being processed by 5 people. And we are 50% through that, and in the first phase, we've got 83% success in terms of closing the wayleaves. So it's a game changer. It took a long time to implement. I won't take all the credit. It was my idea. I didn't do the execution of it. We outsourced that. But effectively, what we've got is a number of systems that are connected together. So we've got a CRM, and there's some APIs into LandReg. We've got our own database information that we've purchased, some OS data, Company's House. We've got some other mapping systems that we API into. So we take the information from the design partner or the operator's in-house design team. We process that data. That data is then stored in a CRM. We've then got a project management application that sits over the top of that, which takes each of the individual tasks and then sets the Wayleave officer a list of tasks. Those tasks are checked against the freeholder. So have we got an existing relationship with that freeholder? If so, there's a task, get on the phone, send an email, process that. If we don't have existing relationships, then we go through a 4-stage process, and those letters are automatically generated. We agree to templates with the operator within the setup phase of the project, and those are automatically distributed through a mailing house at 2-week intervals. And really what we're trying to do there is build a process so that if we or the operator choose that we need to go to court, we can demonstrate and evidence the fact that we've acted reasonably. So in our view, acting reasonably is making 4 attempts to contact the freeholder to gain their permission to access that building. So I won't run you through all of the information on this slide, but the whole process is about getting traction, taking the kind of labour-intensive, boring roles, to be honest, out of that process and automating them, and then having people that deal with the objections and overcome those objections, because effectively what we're trying to do is to allow the operators to build quicker. And that is it. Any questions? Gentlemen in the middle. Oh, sorry. Okay.
So I was on a dog walk the other day. It's a good story, this. I've just lost it. So basically there was a sign up on a lamppost, and I'm guessing that this was their way of getting a wayleave.
It was probably one of ours.
Yeah. So what it says is, you're hereby notified, I won't say who it is, but we intend to install electronic communication equipment on the land, exercising right of an operator in accordance with the Electronic Communications Code. So it says, we seek the agreement of the owner or occupier to exercise its right, but fundamentally it goes on to say, if you do not respond within 28 days, we will carry out the work to keep installed on the land electronic communications equipment, and we will then require the right to continue the access to the land, inspect, maintain, adjust, alter, repair, or upgrade. So it's almost as if they've put a sign on there, waiting for no one to respond, and then they're going to walk on there and say,
Yeah, so,
you never said no.
So we do that, not so much on private land, on private roads, we do it a lot. So what they're trying to do is, as I said, create an argument to the court. So when you're in front of the tribunal and they say, well, what have you done to try and get the necessary, if there's a trespass claim, what have you done to gain the permission of the and you say, we didn't know who the freeholder was. Well, what did you do to try and learn who was the freeholder? One of the avenues that we do is put signs up. Now, typically on private roads are a big issue. So about 12% of properties in the UK are on a private road. And we categorise private roads in 3 ways. One is where there's a single owner, which is probably the easiest. So we find out who the owner is, and we engage with that person, and they do or don't give us the wayleave. There's no ownership. There's a huge volume of roads, because prior to the land registry, post land registry, the only requirement is if that road, the ownership of that road changes hands, then the land registry gets updated. So if that road hasn't changed hands for 50 years, there won't be an owner. So trying to find out who owns that is difficult. A more common problem recently is due to the cuts in government funding to local authorities. In the good old days, if I was a house builder, I was building an estate, there's a process of adoption. So I build the roads to a certain standard. As long as I meet that standard, I effectively gift those roads to the local authority, and the local authority will then maintain those roads and the lighting and all the rest of it, and they could grant permission. The local authority's view is now we're not adopting those because that's just an extra cost and we're financially constrained. So the builders and the developers' answer to that is when you purchase a house, you own the pavement and the road outside your house. So we could have a road that the operator's trying to build down, there's 100 roads. We've got to get agreement from 100 individual people to. That's a nightmare. Now, our advice is typically let's get the majority, and if anybody else complains, we'll deal with the trespass claims. But even getting a majority, 51%, is difficult because, you know, there's a lot of rental properties trying to find the owner, etc., etc. So George will give you the legalese about those signs, but in a practical kind of environment, that we do that, and it is successful.
I was going to say, sorry, can everyone hear me okay? So Terry kind of covered it off really, but essentially if we don't, thank you. Not sure how well my dulcet Yorkshire tones sound over a microphone, but I'll go for it. So Terry put it quite well, but essentially, even if the road's unregistered, it could be because the freeholder's died and no one's inherited the estate, don't know who it is. It could be a company that owned it, they've gone insolvent. Could be any number of reasons. And technically, if it's private land, to dig on it without a wayleave is trespass, technically. But if you can't find out who it is, there's going to be a huge part of the country that you just can't dig. So that's why we try and mitigate. So there's no real defence for trespass to put the legalese on it, but we try and mitigate. So if the owner does come forward, we can say, look, we've done X, Y, Z. We did our very best. We went and knocked doors. We put postcards through the doors. We put signs up. Desperately tried to find it. Ultimately, we need to roll this network out. It's for the public benefit. It's to meet government targets. You know, here's our evidence. So that's what those signs are. It actually does sound like one of ours. It wouldn't surprise me if it was. But that's what those signs are. It's a way of mitigating that risk. So it's not your first port of call, but when you've got nothing else to do, if you've got no other way of finding the owner.
It's probably us or GigaClear, I'm guessing.
No, much smaller organ. I'll tell you who afterwards.
It does work. Any other questions?
Thank you. Slightly out of blue question. You mentioned both consideration and compensation. Mm-hmm. Bearing in mind the huge number of wayleaves that are granted to private people, that amount of money must be quite significant. And the question is, does HMRC regard that as income for those people?
It's a tricky question. I'm not a tax lawyer. But ordinarily, what we try and do with the consideration, where you're looking at, if you're looking at mobile sites, if you're looking at a cell site and you're taking out a lease on that site, then it would be vatable so far as it falls within the right to be, you know, for like any other commercial property. So that's kind of dealt with separately. For a wayleave, we tend to see consideration payments of much smaller amounts, and they tend to be, £1,000 one-off payment, £500 one-off payment. It's only when you get to the really big builds that it might be more than that. But in terms of, ordinarily, no. I think it would depend on other circumstances as to whether that was seen as a gain and an income on that property. I think a small nominal one-off payment, probably not, but a recurring annual payment that represented a lease, maybe.
Does HMRC know this?
Wouldn't it be classed as unearned income?
Potentially, but as I said, it's I think it depends on a number of factors from their side, really, as to how they report that. But it's I don't think it attracts VAT. But as I said, I'm not a tax lawyer, so...
We're seeing a big change very recently in terms of the mindset of freeholders, particularly in housing associations. I think the penny has now dropped that they can't really stop this. You know, the amount of government information that's out there about the fibre rollout plans. So their tact has now changed from, we can't object to it, we need to see this as an opportunity. So their costs are now increasing. And to be fair to them, particularly in the social housing space, they don't have a huge amount of resource to process these. So we are increasingly seeing housing associations come to us to say, I'm getting constantly bombarded by 10, 12, 15 operators ringing me once a week saying, can I install fibre in? And they say, well, I haven't got the time to deal with this. Can you help me? We've got a bit of a conflict because invariably we're always acting on the part of the operator, but we say, well, we can help you crystallise your thoughts. So they say, well, actually, if we start raising some fees associated with that, they can then employ somebody to deal with those and process those. So hopefully that will speed up the whole process. But also what we're finding as well is when we act on behalf of an operator, the first thing the freeholder does is Google the operator, and if they see we don't work for City Fibre, but City Fibre is a good example, they see they've just raised £6 billion of funding, suddenly what they were going to ask for £100 consideration suddenly becomes £2,000, £3,000, £5,000 of consideration. So we're at regular events, so Barn are a great example of an operator who are in the rural community. They pretty much don't ever get asked for fees because their view is they're facilitating in a rural environment, they've got that local engagement, and that works really well. Replicating that on scale is really, really difficult.
I think as well, and just kind of going on from the housing association's point and to your point as well, the consideration fee, as much as it is a benefit for to enter the contract, I think you see it, we're not really talking consideration fees on great scales for individual landowners. We tend to see it more so where it's a corporate that owns the property, and they say, well, we want it's not compensation, but so it's not to compensate them for any loss, but they say, well, we need to charge X amount per unit because we might have an ongoing obligation. So it's not compensation that could be quantified, and it technically is a benefit and falls somewhere in between. Obviously, that would then be income against their business. Obviously, it would if we were to pay that. So it would be calculated in that way. But we see that much more often than it's not your individual freeholders that are that tend to be going after any sort of large sums. Yep.
Yeah, this is a slightly hypothetical question, but it's a situation I've spectated on. I have a customer who, for many years, has observed the BT chamber sitting in their front lawn and thought nothing of it, until such time as BT started to engage in doing some work, pulling new cable into that chamber, and in doing so caused a fair amount of disruption to the surrounding flower beds and so forth. They've been there some years and thought nothing of it at all until this occurred. Then they decided to explore whether they actually owned the land it was on. Turned out they did, and there was no wayleave in place. Now, they have pursued them and they've come to some accommodation, which I have no idea. But is there any sort of retrospective arrangement here? If you suddenly discover you've got plant installed on your ground and you've been there for 20 years, is there some sort of limited statute of limitations on this or something of that nature?
There's no statute of limitations to answer it kind of broad brush in that way. What you find is that historically, when the old networks were installed prior to my time, there were a lot of agreements made on the basis of, I hate this phrase, especially being a woman, but on the basis of a gentleman's agreement, a handshake, a verbal agreement, that kind of thing. Or it might be that an agreement was signed and it's not been passed along with the land deeds, it's been forgotten about, because that's an important point. Wayleaves buying successors in title. So if you've signed a wayleave against your house and you sell it, the incoming buyer is bound by that wayleave, but it's not registered on the land registry. So the only way they know they are is if you pass them that wayleave, if you inform the solicitors as part of the conveyancing process. It doesn't always happen, so that could get lost. So it might well be that there's a wayleave that's been lost, that might exist somewhere, and that's what's really difficult with retrospective equipment, and finding that particularly, it's not so much of a problem for obvious reasons with altnets, but with Virgin Media particularly, obviously the old network that they've taken on, and BT, given how long those companies have been going, you find a lot of the time it's, well, you know, have you got the right to be here? But the answer is probably at the time the person who owned the land may well have given them the right to access it, but there's no record of that now. But we do deal with retrospective agreements quite a lot, and oftentimes there's a wayleave entered into just so that everybody's aware, there's clarity on both sides, we know what's happening here.
So Openreach are lobbying hard in terms of assumed wayleave. So if you haven't got a bit of paper that forms a wayleave, it doesn't exist. Openreach are lobbying where copper connection into a particular MDU exists. Their argument is, well, there must have been a wayleave originally, so why can't we just upgrade that to fibre? Now, the altnet market obviously has a very different view on whether that's progress or not, so that's an ongoing battle.
Yeah, I think we'll see more of it as well, obviously, given the incredible use of PIA. The altnets are seeking wayleaves to access the BT infrastructure and use the PIA, but then there's no original wayleave against that infrastructure, so it's highlighting a lot of these problems.
Wayleaves that were signed after 2017 can be assigned, effectively shared, but prior to 2017 they can't be. So we advise a lot of operators who are using PIA, and they said, oh, well, you know, it's BT chambered air, BT pole in the front garden, we'll just use it. But no, you can just use it, but you still need a wayleave. So we term those slightly different. We term them access agreement, and we change the wording very subtly to say that we're advising the freeholder or the occupier that this operator is going to access, and can they sign and you know, agree to them accessing it, rather than sending them a 30-page wayleave to sign, which will scare the bejesus out of them and we'll never get it signed.
So are you saying that Openreach came to put the fibre in our house and they took the cable across our neighbours, they should have had a wayleave for that?
Yes, they should, yeah. Any third-party land. So what you find...
Even though the copper was there already?
Or not, they might have already had if it was their copper, if it was their network, if they've got an infrastructure there, the way they might already have a wayleave in place, or believe they have that, because ordinarily one of the code rights, I mean, you read quite a long list of rights out there, the rights under the code, so upgrade is one of those. So if they're upgrading existing copper or they're using infrastructure to do that, they might be able to do that under the wayleave they've got, but originally, yes, they would have needed one.
The challenge is finding them.
Yeah.
Back to, I think, Kelly's point.
Yeah.
The data records, you know, all on paper. Somebody mentioned 9X. I remember one of the 9X offices, they all got made redundant and they set fire to as much paperwork as they could find in a skip in the car park. So all of the fibre plans and probably all the wayleaves went up on that day.
You had the resurrection shift. You did it really well. Any more questions? Terry, George, thank you very much.
Thank you.